Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. Welcome to the Eagleton Institute of Politics. I'm John Weingart. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you here and that so many people have come to hear Ira Shapiro. I've known Ira for a long time. We first met, fittingly enough, given today's program, on the campaign trail. It was a year when we were both on the ballot, and we were out looking for votes. And one evening we found ourselves knocking on the same doors, and we started to talk, and we became friends. We weren't running for the same office. Ira was seeking to represent the junior class on the student council at Brandeis University, and I was hoping to represent the sophomore class. We both won, and I'm sure higher education in Massachusetts is much better as a result. After graduating from Brandeis, Ira's plan was to become a political science professor, but a summer internship with Jacob Javits, the Republican senator from New York State, led him to change directions. He went to law school at the University of Pennsylvania, clerked for a federal judge, worked briefly in a Chicago law firm, and then was hired by Senator Gaylord Nelson, Democrat from Wisconsin, to be his legislative legal counsel. Ira spent the next 12 years in the U.S. Senate working for several individual senators and several committees. He left the Senate in 1988 and entered private law practice, but returned to government during the Clinton administration, where he served first as the general counsel to the U.S. Trade Representative and helped to complete NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. In 1995, President Clinton's nomination of Ira for the rank of ambassador was unanimously confirmed by the Senate, and in that capacity he was involved in negotiating a series of bilateral trade issues with Japan, Canada, and Russia. In 2002, Ira ran for Congress from the district in which he lived in Montgomery County, Maryland. It was a spirited race which received national attention, and in fact generated even more attention than our campaigns for the Student Council had received. Unfortunately, in politics, spirited is rarely used as a synonym for victorious. And Ira has continued to work as an attorney practicing international trade law, focusing primarily on World Trade Organization disputes and issues related to Japan. The Last Great Senate, which has just been published in the last couple of weeks, is his first book. And having read it from cover to cover last week, I can tell you it is a fascinating, thought-provoking, and hard-to-put-down book, and I recommend it highly. If you're familiar with Robert Caro's book about the Senate when Lyndon Johnson was a member, this reads like a great sequel, picking up the story about 20 years later. The book is for sale in the lobby, and after the talk, Ira will be available to sign copies. I am delighted to introduce to you Ambassador and former Student Council member Ira Shapiro.
John, thank you for that kind introduction, and it's wonderful to have an audience that laughs at even his jokes. This has great potential, at least for the first few minutes. It's actually quite special for me to see John and Debbie, who are two of my oldest friends. In fact, I think Debbie and I are vaguely related. We have a cousin in common, and we don't see each other that often, but it's always wonderful to see people you go back a long way with. It is true that we did run for Brandeis Student Council and did not run against each other. I actually ran against a very noted Democrat later in life, Sidney Blumenthal, who was in the Clinton White House and is also a great author, wonderful journalist. He's written some very good books. Sidney's last book about the Clinton years had long passages about his life. He covered everything except his defeat for Student Council. But I guess that's all right. I'm glad to be here for a variety of reasons. I mentioned to John and Debbie that both my father-in-law and mother-in-law went to Rutgers and Douglas and years ago. So this is sort of a sentimental trip as well as anything else. Speaking at the Eagleton Institute, just a couple of weeks ago, I was actually in St. Louis to celebrate the public service of Senator Tom Eagleton, who is no relation, but was a senator who was generally only known for one thing, being forced off the ticket in 1972, but was actually a fabulous senator and somebody who was a very close friend of mine. So I was out there sort of commemorating him, and there are parts of the book that touch on Eagleton, and I think he comes through with the kind of incredible humor and intellect that he had. Traditionally, for many years, I never used notes at all. I've got to check the time so I don't go too long. Never used notes at all, but when I came out with the book a couple of weeks ago, at the first event celebrating it, I started speaking, and I got to a point where I said, now there are 3 changes that need to be made in the Senate rules. And then I had a Rick Perry moment. And the worst of it was, he got out 2 of his 3, and I only got out 1. So since then I've kind of returned to notes. John's reference to our Brandeis experience is important in the sense that I graduated Brandeis in 1969. He graduated the year after. If you went to college from 1965 to 1969, those were very turbulent years in America. In the fall of 1965, when we got to college, the country seemed bathed in a sort of a golden glow of peace and prosperity. Actually, the peace had already been disrupted, but we didn't quite know it yet until a little later. By the time we left in 1969, the country was sort of in fragments, and it was one of the worst periods of years one can remember because of the Vietnam War and violence in the cities. A lot of us who were affected by those times were looking for an outlet and a way to perhaps contribute to improve the country. And that was kind of what led me to the United States Senate. I actually got to the Senate as a summer intern one day after graduating college. So that was 1969. I once said that I was in my 6th decade of dealing with the Senate, which isn't bad if you're only 64 years old. So I got the opportunity to be a Senate intern in 1969, and I grew greatly interested in what you could accomplish in the Senate. I decided to go to law school. I came back. I did 12 years in the Senate later, ending in 1987. There were people that served longer than I did, certainly, but not too many people got to work for the people I did. Javits, when I was an intern, Gaylord Nelson, Tom Eagleton, Abe Ribicoff, Robert Byrd, and then later Jay Rockefeller. So I dealt with a lot of senators. So that was 1987. Fast forward to 2008. In 2008, a group of us who had worked together 30 years before started having breakfast because the political campaign was so interesting. And we would talk about Obama and Hillary and McCain, and it was just an interesting year. And then we would start talking about the Senate and remembering how it had been and how the current Senate was virtually unrecognizable to us. Polarized and paralyzed and it's unrecognizable. And so I came out of one of those breakfasts and I decided I was going to write a book about the Senate when it was great. So at the next breakfast, I announced this to my friends with sort of trembling excitement, and they were sort of underwhelmed. One of them said, "Great, pass the salt," because I don't think they believed me, and I did have a day job, but I got caught up in researching the Senate, and you basically, when you start your work on something like this, and many of you have probably written before I did, but when you start writing a book, every book has its own research challenges. And in mine, there were 2 threshold questions. Did the Senate seem great only because I was young? Did the Senate seem great only because I was there? And fortunately, my research led me to the opposite conclusion. I concluded that from the early 60s through the 70s, 1963 to 1980, the United States had a great Senate. A Senate that functioned more like the Founding Fathers had contemplated the Senate would be. A group of wise men, and at that time they virtually all were men, who came together in vigorous debate for principled compromise to advance the national interest. You can't think of an item of importance in that period of time, a challenge from civil rights to Vietnam to Watergate to the environment, anything that was going on at that time. The Senate was in the forefront of it. And the names of those senators, the Humphreys and Muskies and Jacksons, Howard Baker, Javits, those names still resonate in their states and even in Washington. They were on the cutting edge of change in America. And what I discovered was it was vastly different, of course. That Senate was vastly different from the Senate we have today. But it was also vastly different than what had come before. Because it turns out that the Senate, the world's greatest legislative body, had been a very serious disappointment in many periods of American life, and particularly in the 20th century. Not just a careful check on legislation, the way it was supposed to be, tempering what the House of Representatives was doing, but actually a block on the country's progress, dominated by minority interests, the southern states, particularly civil rights, but other things as well. And so for a long time, the Senate was a reactionary body. Lyndon Johnson dragged it kicking and screaming into the 20th century, but in my view, the Senate only got great after Johnson became vice president and then president. The Senate was led by Mike Mansfield, and it went on to be a great Senate. I think I'll take off my jacket, actually, if that's all right. Just put it. So I called it the book, The Last Great Senate. But actually, it might have been the first great Senate. It could conceivably be the only great Senate. When I Google the term Great Senate, the only thing that comes up is my book. No, I think I actually coined the notion. And it's sort of funny because some of the reviews that have come out, which have been very nice, the reviews sort of accept the premise. Well, we had a great Senate in the 1960s and 70s, and that's terrific. Nobody knew that until I wrote the book, so I was kind of excited about that. So the Senate that I think of as great in the 60s and 70s came to an end in 1980. Ronald Reagan's landslide swept out a lot of people who had been experienced, progressive legislators with great accomplishments. It was the largest exodus of experienced, talented senators that we've ever had. They were replaced by sort of neophytes who were mostly very conservative, but Republicans, really quite inexperienced. Many of them came without political accomplishments and left 6 years later with that record intact. So I call it a great Senate. And the question is, what makes the Senate great? What made it great? So the first is, it was an unusual group of people. Tom Brokaw's Greatest Generation doesn't need any footnotes or postscript from me. But the fact is that the men who came back from World War II went back to their states, got into politics. They were an unusual group of people. They had confidence in themselves and in the country. They had a belief in what government could accomplish and a faith in politics. They had seen what America's strengths were, and they were prepared to rectify its weaknesses. So they became party builders and they became progressives, and they found their way into the Senate. And they had a sense that came out of World War II and then continued in the Cold War of shared national purpose in a very real sense. And the truth is that men who had gone on the beach at Normandy or, Iwo Jima, they didn't think that casting a hard vote was the toughest thing they had ever done. So they were an unusual group of people. But it wasn't just, I've discovered it wasn't just the quality of the people. It was a concept of the Senate that they had. Senators take a pledge to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, but they also take, in my view, at that time, an unspoken pledge. And the unspoken pledge was, we've been given this great privilege of being senators. It's the most venerable title the Republican bestow. We have a 6-year term, and hopefully usually we have multiple 6-year terms. We get to work on the whole range of domestic and foreign policy issues. We can drill deep into issues, or we can range wide on issues. And in return for all that, we developed this experience, and when we sought out the pressures on ourselves, we're members of a party and we represent a state, but what really mattered to them was the national interest. That was their North Star. That was what they were there for. They were there to figure out the national interest. And usually that's what they did. They had these fierce debates, and as people would say, they debated and you thought they hated each other, and then they went out to dinner. They knew what they were there for. So number one, it was the national interest and that focus on it. Number two was the concept of the Senate that they had was that the Senate was what mattered. They had individual agendas. Obviously, they had priorities and agendas. But ultimately, the Senate was a body that had to take collective action. And so that meant you didn't paralyze the institution. You debated, and then at some point, it was time to vote. And sometimes you didn't win. But that was what the process was. Mike Mansfield, the longest-serving majority leader, would always say, it's not the individual senators that matter. It's the Senate that's the rock of the republic. And that's how they behaved. The third thing I would say that was important is they were responding in that period of time to moral imperatives. The moral imperative of civil rights. The great Senate was launched with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That was the most towering accomplishment legislatively in American history. Because of that changed the Senate. It was no longer the graveyard of progressive dreams. It became the place where you went to translate those dreams into legislation. And the other moral imperative before very long was the effort to stop the Vietnam War. The senators' bonds were forged in that period of time. In a 6-week period of 1964, or maybe it was 4 weeks, they passed the Civil Rights Act, and then they gave Lyndon Johnson the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which he used as a ticket, a license to wage unlimited war, to escalate the war in Vietnam. And the senators, many of them had misgivings about giving him that authority. None of them thought he was supposed to use it that way. And they spent the next period of time trying to examine the premises of the war, to privately counsel him to stop the war, to publicly try to stop the war, and ultimately they did cut off funding for the war. And the other thing about the Senate that I wanted to say was you can't understand what I call the Great Senate without understanding Mike Mansfield's role. He was the longest-serving majority leader of all time. He followed Lyndon Johnson, and everyone who followed the Senate thought he was going to be a weakling, and he couldn't possibly be like Johnson, who was a sheer force of nature. And so Mansfield comes in, and he says, well, we're going to run the Senate according to the Golden Rule. And everyone thinks he's kidding. We're going to treat everybody sort of equally, and we're going to treat each other well. And they thought he was really kind of out of it. And for a while, it didn't work. His democratized open Senate became paralyzed. And then it started to work. And he built a Senate that was based on mutual trust and respect. And it was bipartisan to the core. Mansfield had breakfast every day with his best friend, George Aiken, the Republican from Vermont, who many of people in our generation would remember as for his famous Vietnam policy, declare victory and leave. But anyway, the bipartisanship, the mutual trust and respect radiated through the Senate from the leadership. Now, I've written a book, so I decided I'd write about this 18-year period. In the course of getting a publisher, the publisher said, "There's a really good book here, it's just not the one you're planning to write." I said, "Really?" He had a lot of experience, and he had the money and for the advance and stuff, so I wanted to listen to him. He said, "I don't want you trudging through 18 years of the Great Senate. Find another way to tell the story." I had an agent at the time. We walked out of the meeting. She said, "You must be discouraged." I said, "Well, no, not really." I said, "It's getting kind of hard trudging through the Civil Rights Act, Vietnam. I mean, what can I add there? I'll find another way to tell the story." And so what I decided to do, I wrote about the last years of the Great Senate. Vietnam's over, ended badly, but it's over. Nixon's off the scene, Watergate's done. The outsider president, Jimmy Carter, is coming into office. It's the beginning of America's third century, and he's greeted with a new Speaker of the House, and from my standpoint, more important, two new Senate leaders, Robert Byrd and Howard Baker. And so the book basically talks about the last years of the Great Senate. So after I unveiled this idea, my agent said to me, "Oh, that's going to be really good. Why don't you call it Great Legislative Battles of the Carter Years?" And I said, "No, I'm going to call it the Last Great Senate." She said, "Well, that's better." And the reason I think it actually is better is because those years that I describe, you can see the Senate the way it worked, but you can also see the politics of the country changing. The politics of moving to the right. The economy's getting worse. The tax revolt is on. Iran's becoming an issue. Afghanistan's becoming an issue. Energy's an issue. In fact, it sounds a lot like now. Sometimes the headlines now sound like they're ripped from the 70s and vice versa. Jimmy Carter last year came out with his White House diary, and one of the comments, he made some contemporary edits on it, comments. And he said, "Barack Obama's dealing with a lot of the problems that I had to deal with. But there's one difference. I had a bipartisan Congress that I could work with." And by that he meant the Senate, because both Carter and Obama had a strong Democratic House and a Democratic leader they could count on. But Carter had a Senate that actually worked with him. So let me just give a few quick examples, and this is just from a 6-month period in 1978, to show, because the title of the book is The Last Great Senate, Courage and Statesmanship in Times of Crisis. And what do I mean by that? Carter decides that we ought to negotiate a new treaty with Panama to control access to the Panama Canal. 5 presidents have thought about doing this. They all know it should have been done, but nobody really wanted to touch it. But Carter wants to go ahead with it. So he informs the Senate, informs Congress too, but it's the Senate that has to consider the treaties. He informs the Senate, and Howard Baker, the Republican leader, new Republican leader, Baker's reaction is, "Why now and why me? This has been around forever." Baker wants to run for president. His staff says to him, "Senator, you touched the Panama Canal treaties," which his party hated and was going to use as a political device. "You touch these treaties and you're never going to be nominated for president." And Baker's no fool. He knows what he's doing. He says, "Yeah, but I'm the Senate leader. If the national interest suggests that we should have new treaties, I've got to do that." And that's what he does. And the treaties pass because of the bipartisanship of Baker. And he never gets nominated for president. At the same time, Frank Church, on the other side of the aisle, a Democrat from Idaho, leading opponent of the Vietnam War, investigated the intelligence agencies. He's going to run for re-election in Idaho, and they're really upset with him already. And his staff says, you can't be re-elected if you get involved in this. And Church says, I've been talking about a new relationship with Latin America and the third world for 25 years. How can I not be involved in this? And he takes the lead on it. They had character. They acted according. They had courage and statesmanship. So that's one example. Second example was that summer, there's a tax revolt going on in California. Proposition 13 started the tax revolt. It's rolling across the country, and people are anti-tax everywhere. New York City had gotten some financial support, emergency support in 1975, but they needed more help to get to economic health. And so they asked for more help. And the Senate has said, we're not going to give you any more help. They said it, the banking committee said it, we're done with you. But and William Proxmire, who's the chairman of the committee, says, I'm against this, but I'll give New York the chance to make their case. And the city comes in with a new mayor, Ed Koch, and Governor Hugh Carey, and they have two of the great senators of all time, Jacob Javits and Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And over the course of a couple of months, the Senate changes its mind because they listen to each other. They listen to the testimony. They actually change their mind. They decide what's best for the country. And then when they get worried about the precedent they're creating by bailing out a city, Richard Lugar, who has just come to the Senate from Indiana and is still there 35 years later, he comes up with a tough love formulation that gives them the aid, but under such stringent conditions, nobody else ever gets it. That's how they did it. They solved these kind of problems. A couple of months after that, Carter, as you remember, some of you would remember, energy policy was at the center of what Carter was doing all the time, and it was a hellaciously difficult thing. Henry Jackson of Washington was the chairman of the new Energy Committee. Jackson and Carter loathed each other. They couldn't even be in the same room together. They hated each other so much. Jackson had run against Carter, and Carter had defeated him, and Jackson looked down on Carter, and there were all kinds of things, and they didn't even agree on policy. But Carter was the president, and Jackson worked for 4 years on the pieces of this energy program, and they made these compromises, and they came up with an energy program that actually reduced oil imports 50% over the next few years. And it was really, truly a painful task, but it couldn't have been done without these people. And that's how they functioned. The Senate chamber then was more like hallowed ground than scorched earth. And in terms of partisanship, I've described it, and I think it was accurate to say it was really a demilitarized zone where partisanship was concerned. Okay, so what happened? I said the 1980 election changed everything, and it did change a lot of things. But when I was starting to research the book, Senators Alan Simpson and Jack Danforth at different times said to me, we understand why 1980 is important in your story, but we had a pretty good Senate in the 1980s. Have you looked at it closely? And I said, well, I've looked at it pretty closely, but I'll keep looking. And I discovered they were actually right, that the Senate made, after a first couple of years, which were pretty rocky, the Senate made a seemingly solid comeback in the mid to late 1980s. There were still some good senators there, and they started working on a bipartisan basis again. And then it headed down. It headed down in the 1990s. And it's always exciting to me to pick up the newspaper today and read about Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum, because part of their legacy was, I think, the real destruction of the Senate. I would focus basically on the arrival of Trent Lott of Mississippi, who came to the Senate in 1989. Most people who come to the Senate really are very happy to be there and really respect the institution. Lott was quite different. In his own memoir, he wrote a fascinating memoir in 2005 where he describes just how much he hated the Senate. He hated it for being disorganized. He hated it for being cold. He hated it for not appreciating him. And he decided he wanted to change it. And fortunately, he said, there was a clique of young conservatives who had come over with him who wanted to help change the Senate. And they did within a relatively rapid period of time. And what happened was, there's a moment in 1995. The Republicans have just taken the Congress. By the way, I'm a Democrat. Did I mention that? The Republicans have just taken the Congress. And Lott is now challenging Alan Simpson, who's still prominent from the Bowles-Simpson Commission. Simpson was the deputy leader, and Lott's going to challenge him. And Connie Mack, who's a new senator from Florida, stands up in the caucus and says, we have a historic opportunity. We have the chance to bring together the House and Senate Republicans because Trent Lott is such a close friend of Newt Gingrich, who is now the Speaker. Well, that's the kind of argument that would have counted for nothing in the old Senate. I mean, the old Senate looked at the House like, they were sort of ants. and the House didn't like them either. But on that day, it carried. And Lott won by one vote. And within a year, Bob Dole had left the Senate to run for president. And Lott became the leader. And the place changed very abruptly after that. By the end of 1996, several Republican moderates, Mark Hatfield, Nancy Kassenbaum, Alan Simpson himself, they all left. Bill Bradley and Sam Nunn left. There was an exodus of moderates. And the Senate really continued, in my view, has gone into a downward spiral for almost 20 years. And by 2005, Lewis Gould, who was a political historian, described the Senate as in profound crisis. But it was going to get worse because most people who thought about this at all thought, well, we'll have the next presidential election, maybe things will get better. So Barack Obama gets elected in 2008, emphatic majority. The country's facing a national crisis, economic crisis, the worst in 80 years. People say that Obama was naive to think that he was going to get bipartisan cooperation. Well, you can count me among those that were naive because I believe the national narrative that we all come together in crisis. But the Republicans in the Senate basically said, we're not going to help him in any way. They made life miserable for the one or two, the two women from Maine, who actually are moderates and wanted to be helpful. And interestingly, it wasn't that different than the Republican reaction to Bill Clinton in 1993. They didn't help him either. It's just that the crisis was so much worse. So the only thing I'll give them credit, the Republican leaders credit for, is transparency. Because Mitch McConnell in 2010 announced that his highest objective was to defeat Barack Obama. Joe Scarborough on MSNBC described that as a pathetic statement. But I think, disgusting is a better word for it. Republican leaders of the sort that I wrote about in the book, particularly Howard Baker, they would never do anything like that. They understood that there were elections and they wanted to win elections, but they also understood there was this period of time between elections when you actually worked for the country, and that the Republicans criticized Obama for his statement when he said, elections have consequences. Well, that's a pretty unremarkable statement. I worked for George McGovern and Walter Mondale. We won one state in each election. It never occurred to me that the elections didn't have consequences. The Democrats that I knew worked with Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. And the Republicans used to work with Democratic presidents, but they've been following a different model in the last 20 years, and that's been a real problem. So, my book is history, but hopefully it's history with some modern relevance. And it's fair to ask, as people do ask, can there be a next great Senate? Or at least can there be a less awful Senate, a respectable Senate? And I think it's easier to be pessimistic at the moment than optimistic. There's no doubt that it's harder to be a senator now than it used to be. I always say that. Yes, the senators I wrote about were really great senators, but it's harder to be a senator now than it used to be. You've got the tremendous demands of fundraising. You've got the 24-hour media. You've got a political conversation that occurs often on Facebook and Twitter. You've got a lobbying corps that's 5 times as big as it was 10 or 20 years ago. So it is harder. If the public is frustrated with the Senate, the senators are actually quite frustrated too, for the most part. I've talked, in the course of bringing out the book, I've talked to a number of the Democratic and Republican senators. And it's interesting how frustrated they are. They won't try to convince you that the thing is actually working. They seem to feel trapped in the hyper-partisan model that has evolved over the last 20 years. My sympathy for them only extends so far. I think that they're not helpless victims. I think they have it in their power to change the situation. I'm not saying it's all that easy, but if they need I would say they need some Senate rules changes. I think they need new leaders, without a doubt, and I think they need a new attitude. And they have that within their power. On the rules changes, I've become kind of a radical on the rules, actually. There are a lot would be wrong. There are a handful of parliamentary experts who really know the parliamentary system in the Senate, and they will tell you that the rules aren't the problem, it's the senators that are the problem. I don't think that's completely false, but I don't think it's true either. I know enough about the rules to know that they don't work. If you were the proverbial man or woman from Mars, intelligent woman from another planet or man, and you stopped in and you looked at the Senate and you said, this place operates by unanimous consent and it has unlimited debate. And those two terms together seem to be a formula for paralysis. I would say that's true. That's exactly what's happened. I believe that whoever's in the majority should not necessarily be able to roll over the minority. I believe in extended debate. But I don't believe in an institution and rules that allow one senator to hold things up indefinitely. Legislation or nominations. We've given too much power to individual senators. And as far back as 1979, Robert Byrd, who venerated the Senate rules, who revered them, as far back as 1979, he figured out that they didn't work. And he said, if we don't make some fundamental changes, we're going to face paralysis someday. And that's what we're facing. So the rules need to be changed. They have this process of they have so-called holds. People put a hold on legislation, or they put a hold on a nomination. And the hold used to mean, I really care about this, so I'd like to be notified so I can be part of it. But that's not what it means anymore. It's come to mean, I'm going to hold this as long as I want. And that you can't run a system like that. And this is one area, and perhaps the only area, that I even agree with Trent Lott, who in his memoir wrote, I'm not sure how these holds changed in this way, as if he hadn't been there. I'm not, but they've completely out of hand. The other thing is, I think this president or any president who's elected deserves the chance to put their government in place. They should be guaranteed a vote on their nominations within 90 or 120 days. And if the responses, the Senate response might be, there are too many nominations, we can't process them all, well, they ought to review them and not have all those Senate confirmations. They used to have about 250, now they have 5 times that. And they confirm all these silly positions, and they shouldn't be doing that. So there are changes that need to be made. On the leadership side, one of the things my book indicates that I think is quite true, the character of the Senate reflects the character of the leaders. It reflects the approach of the leaders. Lyndon Johnson's Senate was discernibly different than Robert Byrd and Howard Baker's Senate. And as I said, Johnson's Senate was vastly different than Mike Mansfield's Senate. I don't mean to apportion blame equally, but these leaders have completely failed. I mean, if you can't make the thing run, you ought to get out and find new leaders. I believe Mitch McConnell is the main problem for the reasons that he has stated, basically. He's out to obstruct and defeat Obama, even though Obama was the president. But I think Reid, Harry Reid, who I feel sorry for, I think the two of them haven't been able to make the Senate work. The Senate would be a vastly different place if you had Dick Durbin of Illinois and Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, or Ben Cardin of Maryland and Rob Portman. There are pairings that would actually work better. And I have this fantasy, and I recognize it's a fantasy, that sometime later this year, some Democrat and some Republican would step forward and say, we're going to run for leader together. We don't know who's going to be in the majority. We don't know who's going to be in the minority, but we think we can do the job however it's done. Now, that probably won't happen, but it's one thought, and it's a better idea than waiting around. And people are always saying, well, you seem to think that the Senate ought to rise above the vitriolic political culture that they're in. And my answer is yes, that's exactly what I think. I think they should be senators. I think they shouldn't be partisan operatives. I think they should rise above the political culture that they're in. They weren't sent to Washington to reflect or exacerbate our differences. They were sent to Washington to overcome them. And so I think they ought to start doing that. The one positive example I will give for the moment, and then I'll stop because I'm not supposed to filibuster. The one positive example that I really like to point to is Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, Republican, former governor, former Secretary of Education. Last fall, and it wasn't well publicized, but Alexander said he left the Republican leadership. He said, in essence, I'm not functioning the way a senator should. The Senate isn't functioning the way it should, and I'm going to change my approach. I want to be free to make the kind of bipartisan deals that used to characterize the Senate. I like to say that he channeled his inner Howard Baker, because he used to work for Baker, instead of his inner Mitch McConnell. But I think other people ought to do that. What's troubling to me, certainly the Republicans in the Senate have moved to the right. But what's troubling to me is the more moderate ones who have been constructive public servants at different times in their career have sort of stopped doing that. They've just become basic partisan operatives. And from my standpoint, if you want to be in a partisan knife fight all the time, you ought to go to the DNC or the RNC or MSNBC. But you shouldn't be a senator, and you particularly shouldn't be a Senate leader. So I guess I will close at that point and hope that we can I can answer questions, we can have a conversation about it. I really appreciate coming up here and finding so many people who are interested in the subject. I'm not surprised, but thank you for taking the time to hear me.
Mic 2, so if you have a question, please let me know, and I'll pass the mic to you. I think I saw a couple hands over here. It's already on.
Mr. Shapiro, thanks for an excellent talk. I have a two-part question, and you've done great service to the United States. The first part of that question appears on the first page of today's business section. You may have seen it. Concerned that China is decimating an embryonic industry in this country, the solar energy industry. So my question is, a lot of economists who are nonpartisan, and I'm not an economist, have stated over the last couple of years during both administrations, but looking at the Clinton administration, that the Office of U.S. Trade Representative does not really represent the interest of American workers in many industries, and that in negotiating these contracts, many of the people who work in the office, including the U.S. Trade Representative and their deputies and other people, then go on to be lobbyists for large companies. And my main question is, you may be aware of the conversation which was recorded by the New York Times and Bloomberg News. Before Steve Jobs became gravely ill, President Obama held a meeting in Silicon Valley with about a dozen key executives from key companies, including Apple. He asked Mr. Jobs why Apple did not manufacture their products in the United States. In the United States, like Ford Motor Company and General Electric and General Motors did at the start of the 20th century. And in being polite, Steve Jobs answered the president, and then I'll give you the answer that I think he wanted to say, but he couldn't say it because it wasn't politically correct. He said to the president, American workers are not flexible. What he really meant to say, which came out now after his death, and it's coming to the surface, if you use contractors in China, like Nike and other companies, and you pay workers $1 or $2 a day, and I'm not a labor or union representative, I'm just an American citizen concerned about the American economy. If you pay workers $1 or $2 a day, you put them up in dormitories away from their family, you bring them in from the rural areas, you work for Foxconn, then you could produce a product which has high profit margins of 41%. So my question is, what is really the benefit of the Office of U.S. Trade Representative, which you didn't address at all tonight, and you were the general counsel in protecting the American economy? Could you comment on that, please?
Well, I'm happy to comment on it. First, the reason I didn't address it was I thought I was supposed to speak about the book that I had written. But I think, look, you've raised a question that's fundamental in terms of the American economy. And I think that most of us who have believed that trade could be beneficial, going both ways, have really rethought that in light of the China situation. China's rise, anyone who tells you that China's rise, that they understood the impact of China's rise on the world economy, I think is kidding you. It's had far more of an effect on the world economy than anyone would have expected. And as a consequence, I think that government policies have had to change, have to change. And I also think that, frankly, Apple started feeling the heat from the New York Times articles that were written recently, which were a very vivid depiction of what was going on at Foxconn and the others. So that's the only reason I didn't address the question, but I think that's a much longer subject than we've got tonight. I knew somebody should not have mentioned that I was involved with U.S. Trade Representatives. I'll just skip right to my political writings.
At the risk of returning to the topic that you talked about tonight, I was watching an old movie the other night. I don't know if you're familiar with it, Advise and Consent.
Oh.
And it has a great scene from the balcony where a Paul Messer kind of character is describing the workings of the Senate to the wife of the French and German ambassador, and especially the French woman is a little bit confused about this Republican and Democrat thing, because in the French houses of legislature, all the liberals are on one side and the conservatives are on the other side, and she's explaining to her that, well, here, we have a Republican Party, we have a Democratic Party, there are liberal Democrats, there are conservative Republicans, back and forth, and it struck me as such an anachronism as the way the Senate is right now, and I just wondered if what we have in terms of the paralysis, even if you would change the rules, if you have a party, okay, where you have a very monolithic conservative party with almost no moderates, and you have another party with very few moderates. If that's the construction, the political construction and the mindset of the people that you're sending there, will just changing the rules be enough?
Well, no, I agree. I mean, I didn't intend to suggest that just changing the rules would be enough. I think you have to change the rules. I think you have to change the leaders. But above all, I think you have to change the attitude of the people who come into the Senate. Not that they sacrifice. I mean, look, if people have views that are much different than mine, that's fine if they get elected. But they have to recognize that they're being sent to an institution where they're supposed to work with other people to sort of discern and derive common policy, basically. And I do think that there are a substantial majority of the people in the Senate who are sufficiently frustrated that you actually could make certain changes, both in rules and in attitudes. But look, it was a lot easier. I don't mean to oversimplify. The Republican Party used to have, as we know, many more progressives, moderates, moderate conservatives. And things are thinning out quite a bit. Somebody said to me once recently, "Don't you think we need a third party in America?" I said, "No, I think we need a second party."
You talked about things. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me all right? Yeah.
I can hear you.
You haven't really spoken about why people do what they do. For example, Olympia Snowe. If you take examples of people who are moderates, I mean, you can have this picture of being pressured by the party. They have to vote with the party, even on issues that you would assume that in the old days they would not have taken an extreme position. You see all these votes with not a single Republican voting for something, which is outrageous. And the Democrats made this appeal to a moderate. They wanted the big tent. And, there was this attempt to get people who, under certain circumstances, might be Republican, but they will be Democrats if they're accepted in the big tent concept. And still they tend to vote, certainly on the Republican side, as a bloc. I'd say, why is Olympia Snowe voting for that? And there must have been a lot of pressure. But, some of these people shouldn't be subject to that pressure. They've been in the elective office. Their rule is not threatened. I mean, I guess they always talk about the Tea Party challenges and stuff. But, some of these people didn't seem subject to Tea Party challenges.
No, well, look.
Successful ones, anyway.
I think, first of all, actually it is difficult. I don't want to extend too much sympathy. But I do think it is difficult to be in a caucus of 45 or 47 people where the leaders and 90% of them are trying to pressure the other 2 or 3. It's an unpleasant way to live. Snowe and Susan Collins have stood up to it from time to time. But I think that Snowe, basically, her conclusion was, I've been working really hard for 17 years. And I was working on these things that I thought were important. And in the committee, it seems like we're doing something. And with individual senators, it seems like we're doing something. And then the party decides, no, we're just going to oppose it. I mean, she spent hundreds and hundreds of hours on the Gang of Six healthcare initiative, only to be told that, forget it. We're against this because Obama's for it. So I think ultimately her frustration got the better of her. Now I prefer, as I said, Alexander's approach, in trying to change his approach. But in fairness, she's been trying for a long time. And at a certain point, you will drive out good people.
When you talked about rules in the Senate, you didn't mention specifically about the filibuster rule. There was a time when Bill Frist was majority leader that he talked about this nuclear option, which eliminated that for judicial nominations. Could you comment on what you think about filibuster? Is it a good thing or bad thing? Should it be changed?
I have some friends that think I'm a little soft on the filibuster rule. Mostly everyone knows, sort of the general, in this audience, mostly everyone knows about the filibusters. It used to be that filibusters were infrequent and real, and they were, real issues, and people actually stood up and filibustered, and you didn't do it very often. Now, because of the way the Senate works, you can just sort of threaten to filibuster and paralyze everything, and that's why I wanted to deal with the holds that make that kind of thing possible. The reason I'm a little soft on the filibuster is that I think that it is possible to conceive of a Senate that works with more extended debate than the House, doesn't work on strictly majoritarian views. And the reason I say that is because I'm a little concerned that someday I'll be in the minority and that the Senate might be the only recourse for at least considering what's going on. That's a tough question for that reason. I think if you make some of the other changes and you got back to the point these filibusters were infrequent and serious and on big things, then it would be more acceptable. No, sorry.
So you talked a little bit about how we got to what you called the Great Senate, and you sort of brushed over the Johnson period. I mean, you read Robert Caro, the impression you get from him is that the Senate is historically dysfunctional, and then Lyndon Johnson came along and turned it into a functional body for a short period of time. I just wonder if you sort of react to that about Johnson's role, and it seems like that's a very different way of making a functional Senate than you were talking about.
No, absolutely. Look, Johnson, thanks to Caro, Johnson's leadership in the Senate will live forever. Thanks to Caro, I had an opening to write a book about the forgotten Senate that came after Johnson. As I said, Johnson was a virtuoso and a force of nature, and he picked up the reactionary Senate and moved it into the 20th century. Within a relatively short time, his abusive tactics were starting to wear really thin on people. And by the time, he became majority leader, I think, in 1955. And by the time it was 59, there was a very much more progressive group of Democrats, and they were just tired of the way he treated people. He denied people committee assignments, he denied people office space, he used every carrot, and he bludgeoned people, and it wore people out. There's a great story that I refer to in the book. There are a few great stories, I have to admit. You have to read the book. It can be bought there, but can also be Kindleized and all those other things. But there's a couple of stories when Johnson first he's majority leader, and Ed Muskie comes into the Senate. And Muskie's a proud and sort of prickly guy who's governor of Maine. And Johnson takes him aside and says to him, Ed, you don't have to commit on votes. You just wait till it gets to the M, and then just take a look at me. And so the first vote that comes up was actually a rules change that mattered a lot to Johnson. And Muskie just sort of sat there, and Johnson looks at him, and Muskie says, I'm just waiting till the M's come up, Lyndon. And so he voted against him. And Johnson starts referring to Muskie as just a chicken shit, which was his all-purpose expression for anyone who disrespected him. He gives him the worst possible committee assignments he can come up with, denies him everything. And it turns out to be a favor, because he puts Muskie on the Public Works Committee just as the environment becomes an issue. And Muskie becomes an environmental leader because Johnson has punished him. But the other story that happens in 1959, Senator Joe Clark of Pennsylvania does something that Johnson doesn't like. And Bobby Baker, who's the Secretary of the Senate and Johnson's sort of bag man, says, you got to talk to Clark. You can't let him behave that way. So Johnson goes off to the back of the chamber, and you see them jawing at each other. And Johnson comes back to Baker and he says, "He told me to go to hell. Now what do I do?" So they were getting tired of Johnson. And when Mansfield came in, as I said, it took some real adjustment for them. And some of the senators pined for a stronger leader, but ultimately they concluded they were better off.
Is it part of the problem the way political contributions are made? It just seems that now there seem to be unlimited political contributions through the PACs and things like that, where they used to have the thing where it would almost seem better if the federal government financed the campaigns. I don't know.
Well, look, the political contribution system has been bad for quite a while, and each year seems to offer a worse variation of it with these super PACs in light of the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United. I think that the thing that I focus on a little bit, other people feel differently, and they believe the whole thing is corrupt because, the truth is, the thing that bothers me about it is that the senators spend a huge amount of time raising money. I mean, they're supposed to be seriously working on things, and they spend a lot of time going across the street to offices where they can make phone calls all the time to raise money. When I worked for Senator Eagleton, he decided not to run for office again because he thought it would take $1.5 million to get reelected in Missouri. I think it's now more like 15 to 20. And that's an awful system. That's an awful system. The only reason I think it's an awful system in every respect, I do see senators who still function like senators despite it. If you look at Carl Levin of Michigan, or you look at Richard Lugar of Indiana, they have traditionally, it's an awful system, and yet they still function like senators and people who are serious statesmen. Sorry, where were we?
In that vein, could you speak for a minute on what you perceive as the benefits versus the downside of term limits?
I believe in term limits vigorously applied through competitive elections. I think a lot of people get defeated, and I think that's the way it ought to work. I think term limits, if you look around the country, the effect of term limits in cases like California's legislature have been disastrous. They had what was regarded as one of the best legislatures, if not the best in the country, and now it's a joke. So, my personal view is that term limits are not desirable. I think the electorate has shown an ability to throw people out of office. If anything, they're going to throw a lot of people out of office again.
I don't usually need the microphone. Actually, the questions I was going to ask have kind of already been asked. I was going to link term limits, length of the campaign, the amount spent on the campaign, and the lobbyist business and the Supreme Court ruling together, and say if all, and of course term limits is a constitutional issue. The other things are all something that could be done by laws. But I was going to link all of those together and find out whether you.
My answer is yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I mean I do think they are linked together. We have a very. I was thinking about it today. We have a very odd political system. I mean, in some ways, it has extraordinary vitality, right? I mean, we elected the first African American president. We've had 3 of the last 4 secretaries of state are women. I mean, we've had a lot of vitality, a lot of change. But we have these other things that are just inexplicable to anyone in the world. And our much vaunted democratic system is not really a good example to many people anymore.
I was going to make 2 quick political statements that have to do with the Senate, some of these statements may not be completely popular, but you said that Mitch McConnell's primary objective was to make sure that the president does not serve a second term. It does appear to some people that that's his only objective, and that national interest, that's the national interest. The other statement I was going to make is if John McCain had chosen one of the two Republican senators from Maine or a moderate Republican governor as his running mate, and if he had disavowed a little bit some of the things that had gone on under President Bush for 8 years, he might not have able to been nominated to run for president on the Republican Party, but if he was nominated, he might very well be the president right now.
He might. I mean, I think McCain had a very difficult row after 8 years of Bush. I think McCain was a very, very good candidate in 2000 when Bush defeated him. But 8 years later, he wasn't quite the same anymore, as witness his vice presidential choice.
May I ask a question also, if you don't mind? I wonder if you could speak to, if you have any sense of who was staffing the Senate during the last great Senate compared to now.
What a great question.
And if it, well, I think now it's, you're the campaign manager and then you're the chief of staff and it goes back and forth. And how do we come up through the ranks? We come up through the ranks as campaign volunteers and then we get jobs. And I just wonder if you have any sense of, was that always the case?
Well, my friends and I were all really great. No, actually, there is a brief section in the book about this. I mean, it's no real accident that, if you look back and you find that Madeleine Albright and Stephen Breyer and Tim Russert, and you go down, a lot of the senators, Daschle and Alexander and Susan Collins, a lot of them were there. Tom Foley, who became the House Speaker, et cetera. The Senate became a magnet for people who wanted to serve the country, and particularly on the Democratic side when Nixon became president, because the executive branch was, a lot of us were motivated to get into government, and the executive branch wasn't the place we could go, and the Senate was. And it was a place where you could hitch your wagon to somebody who was actually doing some important things, and it's where a lot of us learned our politics. Now, would I say we were better than the people there now? Probably, but no. No, but it's hard to be a great senator or a great Senate staffer in an institution that doesn't work. We were in an institution that worked. Governing, it was sort of a healthy ecosystem. I've got hundreds of friends from the 70s and the early 80s who worked together on a bipartisan basis and are still friends. It was just a healthy ecosystem. And what I like to say about governing, if you've ever been in a legislative process, particularly in Washington, governing's supposed to be difficult. It's always difficult, but it's not supposed to be impossible. It's difficult, so difficult that even people of good faith trying to work on things have difficulty with it. But when you don't have good faith and you're really not trying to work things out, then it gets to be pretty impossible.
I think that was a good place to end, because I don't know, Ira didn't get a chance to mention, but he's written a book, and there are copies of so thank you very much.
Thank you. No, it's one of the nice things about writing the book is you get to go to places like this and talk to people who are so interested, and it's really been wonderful to have such a good audience. Thank you.